The sun was setting over the valley when Henry first noticed something wrong. Rex, his German shepherd, had been pacing near the cabin's edge for hours, his ears pinned back, his breathing shallow and rapid. The dog would bark, then stop abruptly, as if listening for something only he could hear. The storm was coming, Henry knew that much, but Rex wasn't warning him about the weather. The old veteran had learned long ago to trust his dog's instincts, the same way he'd learned to trust his gut in combat. Yet when he looked around the quiet mountainside, he saw nothing. No strangers, no threats. Just the gathering darkness and the wind picking up through the trees. Rex barked again, more urgently this time, and Henry felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that used to warn him of danger. The dog moved toward the forest path, then back to Henry, then toward the path again, as if pleading. But Henry hesitated. Was it paranoia? Had the years of war left him seeing threats everywhere? Henry would dismiss the warning. 3 hours later, the explosion that was meant for Charles would echo through the mountains, and by then it would be far too late to listen. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you never miss stories of courage, loyalty, and redemption. Henry had spent the better part of 30 years trying to forget certain things. The sound of gunfire, the weight of decisions that cost lives, the faces of people he couldn't save. He'd come to these mountains not because he was running from his past, but because he needed space to make peace with it. The military had taught him discipline, strategy, and survival. But it had also left scars that no metal could cover. When people looked at him in town, he caught the familiar sting of it, the hesitation in their eyes, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. Even now, in the 21st century, a black man with a weathered face and calloused hands didn't blend in easily in these small mountain communities. Henry had made his own peace with that truth long ago. He'd learned to move through the world quietly, asking for nothing, bothering no one. His military service had been honorable. He'd served with distinction, earned commendations, and risked everything for people who would never know his name. But that didn't matter much up here. What mattered was that he kept to himself, paid his rent in cash, and didn't draw attention. Rex was different. The dog didn't care about Henry's past or his skin, or the way strangers sometimes crossed to the other side of the street when they saw them coming. Rex simply knew Henry, in the way that only a loyal companion could. The dog had found him 7 years ago, half-starved and abandoned on the forest edge near Henry's cabin. Henry had nursed him back to health, trained him with patience and skill, and over time they'd become inseparable. Where Henry went, Rex went. What Henry feared, Rex sensed. What Henry couldn't say with words, Rex understood with a glance. The bond between them ran deeper than simple companionship. It was the bond between two survivors. Rex had his own trauma, the marks of cruelty still visible in the careful way he moved around sudden sounds. Henry had his own ghosts, the memories that woke him at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat. Together, they formed something whole. Together, they were home. When Henry was silent, Rex didn't demand explanation. When Henry was restless, Rex waited patiently. When Henry's nightmares came, the dog would press his head against the old veteran's chest and simply breathe with him until morning came. This wasn't training or obedience. This was something else entirely. This was love in its purest form. Love without judgment, without condition, without the complicated weight of human history. It was the kind of love that made Henry believe, even on his darkest days, that there was still goodness in the world, that there was still a reason to keep fighting. That loyalty and trust and companionship mattered more than anything the world could take from him. The morning Charles arrived at the edge of Henry's property, everything seemed ordinary at first. The old Jeep pulled to a slow stop near the gate, dust settling around its tires. A man in a wheelchair emerged with the help of a younger woman, presumably hired assistants. He was pale, well-dressed, despite the casual setting, with kind eyes and an easy smile. Charles introduced himself with genuine warmth, explaining that he'd rented a cottage further down the mountain for the next 3 weeks. He was recovering from a difficult period, he said, and needed solitude before a major life event, a wedding that would change everything. The cottage was quiet and private, he assured Henry, and he wouldn't be any trouble. He was simply a man seeking peace before stepping into a new chapter. Henry nodded, said little, and felt comfortable enough with the explanation. But Rex didn't relax. The dog circled Charles slowly, his body tense, his eyes never leaving the stranger. Something in the way Charles moved, or perhaps something deeper that only the dog could sense, triggered a warning Henry had learned never to fully ignore. That evening, as Henry sat on his porch watching the mountains turn gold in the fading light, he found himself thinking about patterns. Danger didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, often wearing a smile. It came with reasonable explanations and gentle words. It asked for trust, and then shattered it. Henry had seen it happen before: soldiers who seemed trustworthy until the moment they weren't, civilians who harbored secrets, allies who became enemies in the space of a single decision. The mountains were beautiful and peaceful, but they were also isolated. They were a place where anything could happen, and nobody would hear about it until spring. Henry looked at Rex, who sat rigidly at the cabin's edge, staring toward the direction Charles had gone. The dog's posture said everything. Something was coming. Something that would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The Smoky Mountains in winter held a particular kind of beauty that most people never took time to appreciate. The peaks rose like ancient sentinels against pale skies, their slopes draped in evergreen that turned almost black when storm clouds gathered overhead. The valleys between them held secrets, narrow passages where wind howled like living things, streams that ran violent with snowmelt, caves that descended into darkness so complete that a person could lose all sense of direction within minutes. Henry had chosen this place deliberately. The isolation suited him. The raw, unforgiving nature of the landscape matched something inside him that had never quite healed from war. Here, among the rocks and the trees and the vast silence, he could exist without explanation. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by winding mountain road. His cabin sat at the end of a private drive, surrounded by forest on 3 sides. No neighbors for miles. No unexpected visitors. No complications. Rex had adapted to this life as naturally as Henry had. The dog understood boundaries. He understood the rhythm of the mountains, the way animals moved with purpose, the way weather changed hours before humans could see it coming, the way sounds carried differently through cold air. The German Shepherd had become something more than a pet. He was a sentinel, a partner, a mirror for Henry's own survival instincts. When Henry woke before dawn, Rex was already alert, ears forward, assessing the day ahead. When storms approached, the dog would pace the perimeter of the cabin, checking every entrance, every potential vulnerability. This wasn't nervousness. This was professionalism born from an animal's ancient understanding of danger. The meeting with Charles had disturbed the careful balance Henry and Rex had established. For 7 years, they had moved through their days with minimal human contact. Now a stranger had appeared, claiming he simply wanted quiet, claiming he was recovering, claiming he posed no threat. Henry had learned that claims meant nothing. Actions were what mattered. Words were cheap, and intentions were invisible until they manifested in consequences. Yet something about Charles seemed genuine. The man's disability, the missing leg, the dependence on the wheelchair created an automatic sympathy in most people. Henry wasn't immune to it, though he'd spent decades learning not to let emotion override judgment. Charles had been polite, respectful, almost deferential, in a way that suggested he understood his presence might not be welcome. He'd offered to stay out of Henry's way, to keep to his rented cottage, to ask nothing of the old veteran except perhaps a polite nod if they happened to pass on the road. These were the words of someone trying not to be a burden. These were the gestures of someone who understood isolation and respected it. But Rex refused to accept any of it. The dog had watched Charles drive away that first day with an intensity that made Henry uneasy. There was no aggression in Rex's response. The dog didn't bark or snarl or show teeth. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Absolute certainty. Rex knew something was wrong. Henry had learned to trust that knowing. Over the following week, Charles became a fixture in the landscape. He would drive past Henry's cabin 3 or 4 times daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with visitors who came and went in expensive cars. The cottage he'd rented apparently came with staff, a chef, a driver, security personnel dressed in dark clothes who moved with military precision. This was not a man recovering in quiet solitude. This was a man conducting business, managing operations, coordinating something that required multiple people and constant communication. Henry watched from a distance, piece by piece assembling a picture that contradicted everything Charles had said about needing peace and solitude. Rex watched too, and his agitation increased proportionally. The dog would disappear into the forest for hours, tracking scents, investigating the movements of Charles's associates. He would return with tension radiating from every muscle, with a kind of desperate urgency that suggested he was trying to communicate something vitally important. One afternoon, Henry found Rex standing at the edge of the forest, a piece of fabric caught in the dog's teeth, dark blue, expensive, torn as if from a struggle. Henry recognized the pattern. Military issue. The kind of clothing worn by security professionals and people trained in combat. His instincts, dormant for years, suddenly reactivated. His hands tensed. His mind began running scenarios, calculating possibilities, preparing for contingencies. The old soldier in him, the part he'd tried to leave behind in the mountains, suddenly woke up. It was Patricia who finally gave Henry clarity. She appeared at his cabin door on a gray afternoon when snow was just beginning to fall, her young face pinched with worry and something else, determination mixed with fear. She was Charles's daughter, she explained quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. Her father hadn't come to the mountains for peace. He'd come because he was being threatened. Someone wanted to hurt him, to take his fortune, to make him disappear. And that someone was her own brother, Nathan, a man consumed by greed, by resentment, by the burning conviction that their father had wronged him and owed him everything. Nathan had a plan, Patricia said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He was going to stage an accident during the upcoming wedding. He was going to make it look like their father had fallen, or been injured in some way that would require massive payouts from insurance policies. He was going to inherit the family fortune and disappear, leaving their father broken and alone. But there was more. Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she explained that Nathan didn't care if their father died in the process. In fact, it would be easier if he did. One less complication. One less person to explain himself to. She'd come to Henry because Rex had somehow shown her that the old veteran was trustworthy. The dog had appeared at her car window the previous evening, hadn't threatened her, had simply stared at her with an intelligence that transcended normal canine behavior, as if trying to tell her something. She'd followed Rex through the forest, found his cabin, and decided that she had nowhere else to turn. "You need to know what he is," Patricia said, meaning her father. "He's not what he seems. He's not a stranger passing through. He's someone important, someone powerful, and my brother is willing to kill for his money." Henry felt the weight of that knowledge settle across his shoulders like a burden he'd thought he'd set down years ago. He looked at Rex, and the dog's entire body seemed to relax as if the animal had been desperately trying to communicate this exact truth and was finally being understood. The mountains had brought him peace once. But peace, Henry was learning, was a luxury that couldn't always last. Sometimes the world's violence followed you into even the most remote places. Sometimes you couldn't escape what needed to be faced. The first sign of trouble came not from Charles, but from Samuel. The sheriff arrived at Henry's cabin on a cold Tuesday morning, his patrol car kicking up gravel as it pulled to a stop. Samuel was a man in his mid-50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the mountains. He was civil enough, but there was something in his eyes of familiar hesitation, a subtle shift in posture that told Henry everything he needed to know about how this conversation would go. Samuel wanted to ask some questions about the strangers in the valley. Henry had been seen near Charles's cottage multiple times. There had been complaints about a large dog roaming the property lines. Was Henry involved in anything he should know about? Was there trouble brewing? The implication hung unspoken in the air between them. What was a black man doing spending so much time around a wealthy white man's property? What was he really after? Henry answered calmly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to do decades ago when every word could be twisted into evidence against him. He was simply a neighbor. The dog roamed freely, as dogs did. He knew nothing about Charles's business or his reasons for being in the mountains. Samuel wrote nothing down. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes never quite meeting Henry's directly. When he left, he didn't apologize for the intrusion or acknowledge the disrespect of the visit. He simply drove away, and Henry understood that a seed had been planted. Suspicion, doubt. The kind of casual racism that didn't announce itself with slurs or violence but instead worked quietly, methodically, poisoning every interaction with the assumption of guilt. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Samuel appeared again, this time with questions about Henry's background, his military service, his reasons for living alone in the mountains. Other townspeople began appearing on the property line, not quite trespassing but making their presence known. Store owners who'd been cordial for years suddenly became distant, barely making eye contact during transactions. Whispers followed Henry through the small-town conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Glances exchanged between neighbors who clearly believed something nefarious was happening. The narrative was simple and devastatingly effective. A lonely old black man, a wealthy white stranger, a valuable property, a situation that stunk of manipulation or worse. Nobody said it directly, but everybody understood the implication. Henry had spent his entire adult life trying to prove his worth, his honor, his fundamental decency as a human being. He'd bled for his country. He'd followed orders, maintained discipline, earned commendations. And yet none of that mattered here, in this small mountain community, where the color of his skin wrote a story that nobody believed he could contradict. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. His reputation, carefully built over 7 years of quiet, respectful living, was crumbling in less than 2 weeks. People he'd helped, the elderly woman whose roof he'd repaired, the young couple whose car he'd fixed now looked at him with uncertainty, as if wondering whether his kindness had been genuine or strategic manipulation. Rex felt the change too. The dog could sense Henry's frustration, his anger, his growing sense of isolation. The German Shepherd's protective instincts intensified, and his behavior around town became more aggressive, more alert. This only fed the narrative. A dangerous dog and a suspicious man, the story wrote itself. The isolation deepened when Henry lost his work. He'd been doing odd jobs for residents throughout the valley: carpentry, mechanics, general repair work. It was honest work, work he took pride in, work that kept him connected to the community even as he preferred solitude. One by one, his regular clients began canceling their appointments. They offered excuses. The jobs had been completed, they'd found someone else, money was tight. But Henry heard what they weren't saying. "We don't feel comfortable having you around anymore. We've been warned about you." We believe the stories. Within 10 days, his income had vanished. His savings would carry him for a while, but Henry understood the deeper threat. This was economic isolation, the kind that preceded something worse. When people decided you were dangerous, they didn't just shun you, they systematically removed your ability to survive, to contribute, to prove yourself valuable to the community. They pushed you toward the margins until you either left or did something that confirmed their suspicions. The psychological weight was enormous. Henry had fought in wars, had faced enemies with weapons and training, but this was different. This was the slow poisoning of reputation, the systematic erosion of trust, the weaponization of assumption and prejudice. He'd survived combat, but he was beginning to understand that he might not survive this. Patricia returned to the cabin 3 days later, her face pale, her hands shaking. Nathan had revealed his true plans to her, and she'd realized he didn't care who knew anymore because he'd decided nobody would believe anyone who tried to stop him. The wedding was scheduled for the following week. During the ceremony, in front of witnesses, Nathan had arranged for an explosion, a small device hidden in Charles's wheelchair that would detonate during a critical moment in the service. The blast wouldn't necessarily kill Charles, but it would injure him severely, make him appear unstable, create chaos and confusion. Then Nathan would step forward as the concerned son, claiming his father had enemies, that someone had tried to murder him. Insurance would pay out massive settlements. Charles would be blamed for his own misfortune, his reputation destroyed, and Nathan would inherit everything while maintaining the appearance of being the heroic son trying to protect his father's legacy. Patricia had stolen documents from Nathan's car, proof of the plot, communications with the person he'd hired to construct the device, financial records showing his motive. She handed them to Henry with desperate urgency. "He knows I know," she said. "He's going to kill me too if I don't disappear. But I can't just leave my father. Please, you have to do something." Henry held the documents in his hands and felt the weight of another impossible situation. He was a man with no credibility in this community, a man under suspicion, a man whose presence had already been deemed dangerous and unwelcome. Who would believe him if he went to Samuel with these accusations against a wealthy white family? Who would trust the word of a black man over the claims of a respected businessman? And yet doing nothing meant allowing murder to happen, meant letting a good man die, meant letting Patricia be silenced. That night the weather shifted. Storm clouds had been building for days, but now they moved with sudden purpose across the mountains. The forecast called for significant snowfall, possibly the first major winter storm of the season. Roads would become treacherous. The valley would be isolated. The mountains, which had always been Henry's refuge, suddenly became a trap. There would be no help coming from outside, no police backup, no rescue teams. Whatever happened in the next 72 hours would happen in the darkness and the snow, with only Henry and Rex standing between Charles and death. Nathan made his move on the evening the first flakes began to fall. He arrived at Charles's cottage with 4 men in dark clothing, security professionals, clearly trained in violence, clearly willing to do whatever was necessary. They came not with subtlety but with the confidence of people who believed nobody would interfere. They had a vehicle waiting. They had weapons. They had a plan to move Charles to a remote location in the mountains where an accident could be arranged without witnesses. They hadn't counted on Henry. They hadn't counted on Rex. They hadn't understood that the old veteran and his dog had already decided what had to be done, regardless of the cost. Rex moved like liquid shadow through the falling snow. Henry had released the dog with a single command, and the German Shepherd understood with absolute clarity what needed to happen. The cabin's back door opened silently, and Rex disappeared into the darkness, his black coat invisible against the storm. Henry moved in the opposite direction, toward Charles's cottage, his body remembering movements it hadn't performed in decades. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. This was what he'd been trained for, not the combat itself, but the decision-making in impossible situations, the willingness to act when others hesitated, the ability to function under extreme pressure when everything felt like it was collapsing. The 4 men had already entered the cottage when Henry arrived. Through the window, he could see them forcing Charles from his wheelchair, handling him roughly despite his disability, their movements efficient and practiced. Nathan stood to the side, watching with the detached expression of someone paying for a service. They were moving toward a vehicle parked in the cottage driveway, clearly intending to transport Charles into the mountains where his death could be arranged without witnesses. Henry had seconds to decide. He could call Samuel, but Samuel would arrive too late, and his credibility was already destroyed. He could try to reason with them, but these men weren't interested in reason. They were professionals, hired to do a job, and they would eliminate any obstacle in their path. There was only one choice. Henry moved forward. The distraction came from Rex. The dog exploded from the forest with a sound that wasn't quite a bark. It was something older, something primal. The sound of a predator announcing its presence. Rex launched himself at the nearest security professional with devastating force, his 100-pound body driving the man to the ground. The other 3 reacted instantly, reaching for weapons, but Henry was already moving. His first punch caught the second man across the jaw, with the kind of precision that only came from thousands of hours of training. The man's head snapped sideways, and Henry didn't stop. He drove his elbow up into the man's face, following through with the kind of violence that didn't hesitate. This wasn't a fair fight, and Henry had no interest in fair. This was survival. This was protection. This was the moment when all his years of discipline and training converged into action. The third man pulled a weapon, but Rex was already there, having dispatched the first assailant with brutal efficiency. The dog's teeth found the man's wrist, and the weapon fell from nerveless fingers. Henry tackled the third man, driving him backward into the cottage wall with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. The man slumped, gasping, unable to continue. Nathan tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Henry grabbed him, spinning him around with a force that sent the younger man crashing to the ground. Henry stood over him, breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, just a moment, he considered doing what rage demanded. Nathan had tried to murder an innocent man. He had manipulated his sister. He had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy that would have destroyed multiple lives. The violence would have been justified. But Henry was a veteran, not a murderer. There was a difference that mattered. He restrained Nathan instead, using techniques he'd learned in the military to immobilize the man without inflicting permanent damage. Rex stood guard, his massive frame blocking any escape route, his eyes tracking every movement Nathan made. Charles watched from inside the cottage, his wheelchair overturned, his face a mixture of shock and gratitude and something else, recognition, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his past had finally caught up with him. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Snow fell in thick curtains now, visibility reduced to a few feet. The road down the mountain was becoming impassable, and Henry understood with absolute clarity that they had maybe an hour before it became completely blocked. He needed to move Charles, needed to get him somewhere safe, needed to prevent Nathan and his associates from causing any more damage. He made a decision. Henry loaded Charles and Patricia into his own vehicle, leaving Rex to guard Nathan and the other security professionals in the cottage. The dog understood the command without hesitation. Stay, protect, watch. Rex positioned himself between the men and the door, a living barrier that nobody would be foolish enough to attempt crossing. Henry drove carefully down the mountain road, Charles beside him in the passenger seat, Patricia in the back. The snow was already accumulating on the asphalt, and the curves were treacherous. One mistake would send them careening off the edge into a drop that would be fatal. Henry's hands were steady on the wheel. His attention never wavered. He had survived far more dangerous situations than this, though none had mattered quite as much. They didn't make it far. Halfway down the mountain, the road became completely blocked by a fallen tree, an old pine that had finally succumbed to the weight of accumulated snow. The vehicle stopped, and Henry understood that they were trapped. Going forward was impossible. Going backward would trap them between the cottage and this barrier. They were in the open, vulnerable, with a blizzard intensifying around them. Charles looked at Henry, and the older man saw something shift in the wealthy man's expression, a recognition that went deeper than the immediate danger. "I know you," Charles said quietly. "I know your face. I know your name. It's been 40 years, but I remember." Henry felt something crack open inside his chest. 40 years, a lifetime of separation, and now, in the middle of a blizzard, on a dying mountain road, the past had reached forward to touch the present. Before Henry could respond, movement erupted around them. Figures emerged from the snow on both sides of the road, more security professionals, these ones working directly for Nathan, arriving as backup with the intention of completing what the initial group had failed to do. They had weapons. They had numbers. They had the advantage of surprise. Henry had only Patricia, a disabled man in a wheelchair, and the hope that Rex would somehow sense the danger and find a way to help. Rex felt the shift in the mountains the way animals always do, a change in pressure, a warning carried on the wind, a sense that the delicate balance holding the mountainside together was about to break. The dog was intelligent enough to understand that Henry needed him, but intelligent enough also to understand that Henry couldn't reach him through the blizzard. So Rex made a choice. The dog moved with purpose through the storm, leaving the cottage behind, following Henry's scent down the mountain road. He moved faster than any human could move, his paws finding purchase in the snow, his body designed for exactly this kind of terrain. Behind him, the cottage became isolated, Nathan and the security professionals trapped inside with the storm closing in around them. But Rex didn't care about them. Rex only cared about Henry. The dog emerged from the snow like a ghost materializing from another world. He appeared between Henry and the armed men, and his posture changed everything. This wasn't a pet. This was a warrior. Rex's lips pulled back from his teeth, and a growl emerged from deep in his chest, a sound that carried the weight of his entire being. The armed men hesitated, and that hesitation cost them. Henry seized the moment, moving with the kind of speed and precision that came from decades of training. He moved through the men like they were obstacles to be overcome, and each one he encountered found himself on the ground, unable to continue. Rex covered his flanks, driving away anyone who tried to circle, protecting Henry's vulnerable points. Together, they were unstoppable. But the mountains were turning against them all. As Henry and Rex fought, the snow continued to accumulate, the wind to intensify. Avalanche conditions were building on the slopes above the road. The delicate structure of snow and ice that had held for days was finally reaching its breaking point. Henry sensed it the way he'd sensed danger so many times before, a vibration in the air, a shift in pressure, a warning that came from instinct rather than conscious observation. He looked up at the slope above them and saw it beginning to move. The snow was coming, tons of it, in a rolling wave that would bury everything in its path. "Move!" he shouted to Patricia, to Charles, to anyone who could hear him through the roar of the wind. Rex understood instantly. The dog's entire body language shifted, and he began herding Henry and the others away from the road, toward the forest edge where trees might provide some protection. Henry grabbed Charles's wheelchair, lifting it with strength born from desperation, and ran. Patricia moved beside him, helping to steady Charles as they fled from the approaching wall of snow. Behind them, the armed men realized too late what was happening. They tried to run, but the avalanche was faster. It caught them, swept them away, buried them under tons of snow and ice. When the roar finally faded, they were gone, erased from the mountainside, as completely as if they'd never existed. Henry, Charles, Patricia, and Rex huddled in the shelter of the forest as the avalanche passed. The sound was deafening, the force of it creating a wind that knocked them all to the ground. When it finally passed and silence returned to the mountains, they were all still alive, still breathing, still fighting. Henry pulled Charles back into a protected alcove, formed by massive boulders and dense trees. The wheelchair was useless now, so Henry improvised a makeshift shelter using branches and his own body heat to protect Charles from the cold. Patricia huddled close to both of them, and Rex positioned himself at the entrance to their shelter, his body blocking the wind, his presence a barrier against the storm. They were trapped. The road below was buried under tons of snow. The road above was cut off. The cottage was miles away through a blizzard that had become impassable. But Henry had faced impossible situations before. He had survived wars and isolation and the slow poison of racial prejudice. He had learned to find strength in the darkest places. And now, sheltered in a small pocket of survival on a mountain being buried by snow, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. He had Rex, who understood loyalty in a way that transcended species. He had Patricia, who had risked everything to do what was right. And he had Charles, a man from his past, a man he'd apparently been meant to protect all along. The mountains raged around them, but inside their small shelter, there was something like peace, the peace that comes from knowing you've done everything you possibly could, and now you simply wait to see if it's enough. The blizzard finally broke at dawn. The snow stopped falling, the wind diminished to a whisper, and the mountains emerged from the storm transformed white and gleaming and brutally beautiful. Henry was the first to wake in their makeshift shelter. His body ached in ways he hadn't experienced in years, muscles protesting movements they'd been forced to make, injuries sustained during the fight beginning to make themselves known. But he was alive. Charles was alive. Patricia was alive. And Rex, pressed against Henry's side, was breathing steadily, his massive body having provided crucial warmth through the night. The dog opened his eyes as Henry stirred, and the German shepherd's tail thumped, once a gesture so normal, so peaceful, that it seemed impossible that the night before had happened at all. They heard the rescue helicopters before they saw them. Samuel had finally done something right. When Henry and Charles and Patricia didn't arrive at their destinations, when communications broke down due to the storm, when the pieces of what had actually happened began to emerge from various sources, the sheriff had mobilized a full rescue operation. The helicopters found them as the sun was climbing above the eastern peaks, and within hours, they were transported down the mountain to a medical facility, where doctors could assess Charles's injuries and treat Henry's wounds. The story that emerged during the following days was complicated and multi-layered. Patricia had given her evidence to authorities. The documents she'd stolen were seized and examined. Nathan's hired professionals, the ones who survived the avalanche, were arrested and began cooperating with investigators to reduce their own sentences. Slowly, the conspiracy unraveled. The plot to murder Charles became known. The financial motive became clear. The sophistication of the plan, the willingness to commit murder for money, the casual disregard for human life. All of it was exposed to the light of day. But there was more. As authorities dug deeper into Charles's background, as they investigated the security professionals he employed, and the reasons he'd come to the Smoky Mountains at all, a deeper history emerged. Charles wasn't just a wealthy businessman. Charles was someone Henry had known 40 years ago, during a time when Henry's life had been very different. They had served together in the military not as combat soldiers but as part of a specialized unit that conducted training and security operations. Charles had been Henry's commanding officer. A man who had shown kindness to the young black soldier when kindness was in short supply. A man who had treated Henry with respect when respect was often withheld. They had served together for 4 years, had formed a bond that transcended rank, had promised each other that if life ever took them in different directions, they would find each other again. Then Henry had been discharged following an injury, and Charles had continued climbing the military hierarchy. Their lives had diverged completely. Henry had disappeared into the mountains seeking peace. Charles had risen to prominence in the business world, accumulating wealth and power, building an empire. But Charles had never forgotten the promise. He had spent decades trying to locate his old friend, trying to understand what had happened to the young soldier whose integrity and courage had impressed him so deeply. When he finally found Henry, or rather, when his investigators found Henry living quietly in the mountains, Charles had made a decision. He would come to the valley himself. He would approach Henry carefully, would give the old veteran space to remember, would wait to see if recognition would eventually come. What Charles hadn't anticipated was that Nathan would stage his coup during this visit, that the conspiracy would emerge at the exact moment when Henry and Charles were finally being reunited after decades of separation. The reconciliation happened in a hospital room, where Charles lay recovering from his injuries, where Henry sat with bandages wrapped around his hands and ribs, where they looked at each other across the span of 40 years, and found that the men they had been were still visible in the faces they had become. Charles told Henry about the decades he'd spent building his fortune, about the ways he'd tried to honor the promise they'd made to each other, about the frustration of searching for someone who had deliberately chosen to disappear. Henry told Charles about the years in the mountains, about the isolation he'd sought, about the way Rex had become his family, about the slow process of making peace with the ghosts of his past. They talked about their military service, about the brothers they'd lost, about the reasons they'd both chosen to step away from the world for a time. And they talked about fate, about how the universe sometimes orchestrates meetings at exactly the moment when they matter most, about how the promise they'd made as young men had somehow transcended time and distance to bring them together again. Patricia visited them both. She was haunted by what her brother had tried to do, by the knowledge that she shared blood with someone capable of such cruelty. But Henry and Charles both assured her that she was not responsible for Nathan's choices, that her courage in coming forward, her willingness to betray her family to prevent murder, had demonstrated a character that was fundamentally different from his. Charles told his daughter that his will was being rewritten, that she would inherit a portion of his estate not because of blood but because of her moral choices, because she had chosen to do what was right, even when it cost her everything. The media coverage was intense and complicated. A wealthy businessman protected from murder by a black veteran and his dog, a story of courage and loyalty and second chances. But the coverage also highlighted the racism that Henry had faced in the small mountain community, the way prejudice had isolated him even as he was trying to do the right thing. Samuel came to the hospital and apologized, a genuine apology, not perfunctory, not defensive. He admitted that he had allowed assumptions to guide his investigation, that he had treated Henry with suspicion born from bias rather than evidence, that he had failed in his duty to protect all citizens equally. He offered his resignation, but Henry refused it. Instead, Henry asked Samuel to do something different, to use his position to build bridges between the law enforcement community and people of color in the valley, to examine the ways that prejudice infiltrated investigations, to commit to being better. Samuel agreed, and over the following months, he began implementing changes that would transform how his department operated. Henry declined offers of payment from Charles, though Charles persisted in trying to compensate him for his sacrifice. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Charles would establish a foundation in Henry's name, not a charity dedicated to the veteran himself, but an organization dedicated to supporting military veterans in rural communities, particularly veterans of color who faced unique challenges in reintegrating into civilian life. Henry would serve on the board of directors. Together, they would ensure that other veterans wouldn't have to suffer the isolation and suspicion that Henry had endured. Rex became famous. The story of the German Shepherd's heroism spread through social media and news outlets. He was featured in several national news segments as an example of extraordinary animal intelligence and loyalty. The dog received commendations from veterans organizations, from animal welfare groups, from communities across the country who saw in Rex's actions a mirror of their own experiences with the animals who had stood beside them through impossible situations. More importantly, the story of Henry and Rex sparked a national conversation about racism in small communities, about the ways that prejudice operated subtly but devastatingly, about the importance of recognizing and challenging assumptions. Universities began citing the case in criminal justice courses. Police departments began examining their own investigative practices, and veterans organizations began reaching out to isolated veterans in rural areas, ensuring that they wouldn't fall through the cracks the way Henry had almost done. The reconciliation between Henry and Charles inspired other people to reach out to friends they'd lost touch with over the years, to honor promises made in youth, to understand that connection and loyalty mattered more than convenience or comfort. 6 months after the events on the mountain, Henry sold his cabin and moved to a smaller house in town, not because he wanted to leave the mountains, but because he wanted to be part of the community rather than separated from it. Charles invited him to move into one of his properties, but Henry declined. He wanted to build his own life in the valley, wanted to demonstrate through his presence that reconciliation was possible, that someone who had been viewed with suspicion could eventually be seen as a valued member of the community. He began offering free repair services to residents, demonstrating through action the character that prejudice had initially prevented people from seeing. Rex became a fixture in the town, his presence a living reminder of loyalty and courage. Children who had heard the story wanted to meet him, wanted to understand the dog who had saved lives. Henry used these moments to talk about responsibility, about the importance of looking beyond first impressions, about the power of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult or costly. Charles and Henry became inseparable again, the friendship that had been interrupted 40 years ago, resuming as if the decades in between had been merely a pause rather than a complete severance. They spent hours on the porch of Henry's new house, looking out at the mountains they both loved, talking about the years they'd lost and the time they still had ahead of them. Charles was eventually forced to use a cane instead of the wheelchair. The injuries he sustained during Nathan's attack had left him with limited mobility, though not the complete disability he'd initially appeared to have. He joked darkly about how his disability had become real as a result of his son's conspiracy, about how the universe had a twisted sense of irony. But he didn't let the physical limitations slow him down. He threw himself into the work of the foundation, into building relationships with veterans organizations, into creating the kind of support network that he wished Henry had possessed during his years of isolation. Patricia eventually testified against her brother in court. Nathan was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, along with multiple other charges. He received a substantial prison sentence and was left to contemplate the choices that had brought him to that cell. Patricia maintained contact with her father, but the relationship was complicated by the knowledge of what Nathan had tried to do. Over time, though, she began to heal, began to understand that her father's choice to forgive her for her brother's actions was an act of grace that deserved to be honored through her own efforts at redemption. The story of Henry and Rex became a testament to the power of loyalty, to the capacity of individuals to rise above prejudice and suspicion, to the importance of giving people a chance to prove their character, rather than judging them based on assumption. News outlets called Henry a hero, but he resisted the label. Heroes, he said, were people who did extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. Henry had simply done what was right. He had protected someone who needed protection. He had acted with integrity when integrity was being questioned. He had trusted his instincts and his dog's instincts, and together they had prevented tragedy. That wasn't heroism, that was simply what decent people did when given the opportunity. But the public didn't accept his modesty. They saw in Henry and Rex a story that transcended the particular circumstances of the mountain valley, that spoke to universal themes of friendship and loyalty, and the possibility of redemption. They saw a veteran who had been marginalized by his community suddenly recognized and honored. They saw a dog whose intelligence and bravery challenged conventional assumptions about what animals were capable of. They saw a complicated tale of racism and recovery, of isolation and connection, of the ways that the past reaches forward to reshape the present. Tell us in the comments your own stories of loyalty and friendship that have changed your lives. Have you had a moment when someone or something unexpected stood beside you when you needed it most? Share your stories with our community. Your voices matter, and your experiences might inspire someone who's struggling right now. If you've been touched by this story of Henry and Rex, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories of real people, real courage, and real transformation every single week. Don't miss the next story. Subscribe now so these tales of human and animal heroism reach you the moment they're published. And make sure to click on the video appearing on your screen right now to watch the next incredible story of loyalty and redemption. These are the moments that remind us why we're here, why we keep fighting, why we never stop believing in the power of connection. Drop a comment 79 for the years Henry waited in the mountains, for the loyalty that never wavered, for the promise that finally came home. Because in the end, that's what this story teaches us. That loyalty transcends time. That judgment based on appearance blinds us to character. That one person's courage can transform an entire community. That a dog's understanding of right and wrong sometimes exceeds our own. That promises made in youth can reshape the future, if we're brave enough to honor them. Henry and Rex didn't set out to be heroes. They simply chose to act with integrity when everything was conspiring against them. They chose to protect the vulnerable. They chose to trust each other when trust was fragile. They chose to believe in connection when isolation seemed easier. And in making those choices, they changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who learned their story. May we all find the courage to make such choices. May we all learn to see beyond our assumptions. May we all understand that loyalty and friendship are not luxuries but necessities, not weaknesses but strengths, not obstacles to survival but the very foundation upon which meaningful survival is built. Henry and Rex showed us that the mountains are beautiful, but the mountains are also where we discover who we truly are, not in isolation, but in connection with others, in moments of crisis that strip away pretense and reveal character. Welcome home, Henry. Welcome home, Rex. Your journey has just begun.